On the 24th of November 2015, two women in the quiet Welsh village of Beddau made a bone-chilling discovery, one that would change their lives forever and cast a dark shadow over the memory of their recently departed friend, Leigh Sabine. Michelle James and Rhian Leigh unearthed a terrifying secret hidden in their garden, a mysterious package left behind by Leigh. As they cut through the plastic layers, keen on discovering what the bizarre package contained, they were confronted with a grotesquely mummified human corpse, revealing a truth more horrifying than they could have imagined. For 18 years, the community had unknowingly lived alongside the remains of Leigh Sabine's husband, a grim secret tucked away in the community garden. I'm MrBizzare, and welcome back to the channel where we dive into the dark abysses of reality, exploring unsettling tales and disturbing accounts from around the world. I've covered lots of disturbing cases of dead bodies being found after many years, and even one mentally ill woman who lived with her husband's corpse, but none can even come close to the deeply troubling case of Leigh Sabine, a woman possessed with indescribable darkness who murdered her husband and kept his mummified body wrapped up in rugs and plastic. I've already covered the discovery of the body in a previous video, but their case and story is so complex it deserves a full video to truly uncover the extent of the horrors the Sabine family truly experienced. So let's start from the very beginning. Leigh was born in a small village in Wales. Abandoned by her mother at an early age, she was passed between relatives and spent some of her childhood in state-run homes. At age 17, she finally found love when she met her future husband, John Sabine, at a hospital in London. John was 11 years older than Leigh and already had a wife and 2 children, but John decided to disregard the family he already had and start an affair with Leigh. And when Leigh became pregnant, John abandoned his wife and children from the previous marriage, and the two ran away together. John's decision to abandon his wife and children suggests a deep-seated disregard for the responsibilities of family and loyalty. He had no issue giving in to his immediate hedonistic desires over the well-being of those who depended on him, reflecting traits of impulsivity, a lack of empathy, and an inability to form a real relationship, all foreshadowing what was to come. Similarly, Leigh's willingness to become involved with a man who could so easily leave his family speaks to her own moral compass and attitudes towards relationships. It exposes a detachment from the consequences of their actions, and perhaps a sense of entitlement where her needs eclipsed the suffering of others. Both were clearly driven by self-serving motives, indifferent to the damage left in their wake. After tying the knot, they emigrated to New Zealand in the 1960s and ended up having 5 children of their own. Their names were Jane, Steve, Susan, Martin, and Leanne. However, just like her own mother, Leigh didn't take well to being a parent and struggled to bond with her children. This inability to form a maternal connection, which is usually so strong in a mother, hints at an underlying darkness within Leigh. Instead, she dreamed of becoming a cabaret singer and abandoning her children, leaving behind her responsibilities to once again start a new life. And so, that is exactly what her and John did. They took their children to a daycare center in 1969 and left them there with the intent of never seeing them again. The abandonment was no doubt devastating for the young Sabines. Jane later recalled, "We thought they were coming back for us, but they never did." The Sabine children were placed into foster care, and what followed was a horrific series of abuses that left permanent scars on their lives. The foster parents subjugated them to relentless beatings, often using belts, sticks, and anything else within reach. Jane recounted how they were not only beaten, but also forced to beat each other, as their foster parents took sadistic pleasure in turning them against one another. The violence wasn't limited to just physical abuse. There were also instances of assault. Jane spoke of the nights filled with terror where they were violated and left feeling powerless and broken. The abuse was not isolated to one incident or one form. It was systematic, relentless. One day, after Jane had beaten her foster father in a game of pool, he retaliated by shattering the pool cue across her face. The force was enough to leave lasting physical damage, but the emotional scars cut even deeper. The children were treated worse than animals, stripped of any semblance of care or nurturing, and made to feel as though they were worth nothing. Despite it all, Jane Sabine, being very young and confused at her abandonment, still deeply loved her parents. "I went to the garden and made 2 little graves. One was for my mum, one was for my dad. I used to pray to them, 'Dear God, if Mummy and Daddy are alive, please send them home. If they're dead, tell them I love them.'" While their abandoned children were suffering horrific abuse, all because of their selfish desires, Leigh and John Sabine had moved to Western Australia. But Leigh's dream of becoming a singer there never materialized. By 1972, she and John had returned to New Zealand, but were living in a different area while using the pseudonyms Leigh Martin and John Martin in an attempt to avoid responsibility for leaving their children. However, they did attempt to contact them over the following years, but the sudden abandonment had strained their relationship. It was not until 1984 that Leigh and John Sabine returned to Auckland, New Zealand, where they had originally deserted their children, who were now grown into young adults. They came back with the intention of reuniting their family, but the children had been deeply disturbed and traumatized by their abandonment and the abuse they had endured while in foster care. Leigh and John's return generated considerable media attention, and they were branded in the press as runaway parents who had left their children without even a goodbye. Jane Sabine, who was 19 at the time of the reunion, described her father's demeanor as somewhat regretful, but Leigh showed no remorse. According to Jane, Dad seemed regretful about leaving us, but Mum never showed any remorse. She was cold, distant, like she had shut that part of her life away. The parents' efforts to reform the family fell apart quickly. Jane and her siblings had endured so much pain, and Leigh's indifference only deepened the divide. During the reunion, Jane moved in with her parents for a short time, hoping to reconnect and possibly gain the answers that she had long sought. However, when Jane began sharing her experiences of the abuse she had suffered in foster care, Leigh's reaction was chillingly detached. Leigh and John dismissed her, refusing to offer any explanation for their abandonment, and not long after, Jane was asked to leave, once again displaying her parents' callous nature. In 1997, Leigh and John Sabine told their neighbours they were going on a holiday up north, but instead they left New Zealand permanently, moving to Wales in the United Kingdom. They took their eldest son, Marty, with them, while the rest of their children remained in New Zealand, abandoned once again. Shortly after arriving in Wales, John simply disappeared. At first, Leigh claimed that she did not know where he had gone. His name remained on official records, registered at their address in the town of Beddau on the voting register, and his pension continued to be claimed by Leigh long after he vanished. When neighbours grew curious and began asking questions, Leigh offered various explanations, and many noted that her behaviour became increasingly bizarre. According to Jane Sabine, she would tell people Dad had gone back to New Zealand, but I knew that wasn't true. In hindsight, something much more sinister had occurred, though at the time there was no proof of any wrongdoing. John's disappearance was never investigated, and Leigh continued with her life, even briefly entering a relationship with a fireman named Derek Ellis. This relationship, like much of Leigh's life, was turbulent and surrounded by rumours. Some reports even suggested that Derek had gone missing, but it was later confirmed by his daughter that Derek Ellis had died from alcoholic liver disease in 2010. It remains unclear whether Marty was aware of what had really happened to his father. Leigh's ability to maintain the facade and control the narratives suggests that she may have manipulated Marty, or perhaps that Marty chose to look the other way out of fear or dependence. However, it is known that Marty lived in the same house for some time following John's disappearance, and there was no indication that he raised any alarms. This ambiguous silence leaves open questions about how much Marty knew and whether he suspected the sinister truth about his father's fate. We will never find out how much Marty truly knew, but it was clear that his past trauma, feelings of abandonment, neglect, and possibly the knowledge of his father's murder all became too much for him, and Marty would take his own life. The siblings in New Zealand found out first, and they called their mother to inform her of Marty's death. Leigh eventually answered the phone, and in a cold and detached manner, she told them that John had also passed away and admitted that she had never truly loved him. This was the last communication the Sabine children had with their mother. It was not just Jane Sabine who suspected something and noticed Leigh Sabine's odd behaviour. In the small town of Beddau, the locals became fascinated by this mysterious woman as she told increasingly complex and bizarre stories. Mary Gardner, a former foster carer, described when she first met Leigh Sabine. She was a bit of an eccentric. I would always say she was as mad as a box of frogs, but she said it with a smile, and she was always fizzy and bubbly. We hit it off. She made me laugh. Despite this, Gardner also noticed that Leigh avoided talking about her past, and retreated from those who got too close. Leigh's house did not contain any photographs either, except for a black and white photo taken during her short stint as a nightclub singer in Australia. I always thought, Leigh, what are you hiding? Haven't you got someone? But Leigh would reply how she was better off on her own, while denying that she had ever had any children. Over the next 2 decades, Leigh lived as she wished, alone in her flat. She would often interact with neighbours, joking that she had a medical skeleton in her home from her days as a nurse. Little did anyone know that Leigh was hinting at a truth far more sinister. On one occasion, she told her friend, Michelle James, that she had a skeleton in her shed. James laughed it off, thinking it was just another joke. She had a dark sense of humour, always saying odd things. Little did James know, this joke was a vital clue that hinted at Leigh's truly evil nature. Another time, after returning home from the hospital, Leigh asked a visitor to the flats named Leigh Williams for a favour. There's a skeleton in the shed, and I need you to move it to the attic to scare the people who move in. I hope it's not a bloody real one, Williams responded, to which Leigh replied, you never know. Sabine even told her hairdresser that people were going to talk about her after she was gone, and that she could be famous. When asked why, Sabine remarked with a wink, because of the body in the bag. In her final weeks on Earth, Leigh Sabine seemed readier than ever to confess her secret. In a conversation with Leigh Williams, she revealed that she had a secret and asked Williams for her address, saying that she wanted to write her a letter. The letter never came, but when Leigh Sabine died from cancer in 2015, her secret would finally be uncovered. A few weeks after Leigh Sabine's death, Michelle James and her neighbour, Rhian Leigh, were clearing out Miss Sabine's possessions when they came across a big package under the plotting table in the garden. Assuming it was the medical skeleton they'd heard about so often, they decided to play a prank. We thought we'd bring it in, put it on the settee, and give a knock to the neighbour to come down to see, as a joke. So they took 2 kitchen knives and headed out onto the patio, ready to uncover its contents. They were surprised by how well packaged the skeleton was. However, after cutting through the multiple plastic layers, they were confronted with a horrible reality. A foul-smelling fluid oozed out, staining their hands, and then the overwhelming stench of death hit them. Suddenly, a pool of black sludge poured out all over my hands and arms, and we were hit by the worst smell you can imagine. I started screaming, "It's a body, a real body," said Michelle James. 18 years after he had gone missing, these 2 unfortunate women had just discovered the grotesque remains of John Sabine. Horrified, the 2 women quickly alerted authorities. The first officers on the scene were met with a stench they would never forget. PC Joy Nichols remembers the smell as overwhelming, and they soon discovered the source when they revealed what was actually wrapped inside the package. A human corpse, wrapped 41 times in plastic supermarket bags, as well as covered in tin foil and carpet, which had created a mummifying effect, meaning that there was no decomposition or any maggots. Not knowing the corpse's identity from the outset, investigators concluded that it was the body of a man aged in his 40s who had died as a result of blunt force trauma, An initial inspection by the pathologist deemed that the body could have been dead for weeks or even months, but the investigation that followed would turn that hypothesis on its head and shock the entire community to its very core. South Wales police had no recent missing persons reports, no reported assaults, and not even any emergency calls to follow up on. To begin with, they speculated that the corpse may have been dumped on the patio by someone from outside the area, but the patio was only accessible through the apartments, which pointed the finger at its residents. It's important to note that these were communal gardens shared by the residents of Tremicum Flats, where many people, including Leigh Sabine, lived. Michelle James, who found the body, was the first to be arrested and taken in for questioning. When she told the police to look at her former neighbour, Leigh Sabine, as she was the one who told her about the package, calling it a medical skeleton, they were quick to discover that a man named John Sabine had once been registered at the same address as Leigh. However, the police discovered John's death certificate while searching through Leigh Sabine's belongings, which claimed that John had died of an illness years earlier. This initially misled investigators and briefly led them to rule out that the unidentified body could be John Sabine. Upon reassessment, though, officers found discrepancies between the death certificate and John's official records, which cast doubt upon Leigh's claims. Eventually, authorities obtained a DNA sample from a relative in 2016, which conclusively identified the body as John Sabine. Now, the questions that remained were, who killed him? How did they kill him? And why? An inquest into John Sabine's death confirmed that Mr. Sabine's body was well preserved because of a process called chemical mummification, which can persist for years or even centuries. To narrow down the time frame, investigators looked at the clothing John was wearing. They were pajamas from Marks and Spencer's, which, as it turned out, had been discontinued in 1999. This heavily suggested that the murder had to have taken place before then. Precisely what happened and the circumstances will sadly never totally be known, Coroner Andrew Barkley said. But then, during the inquest, Valerie Chalkley, a friend of Leigh Sabine, stepped forward and recounted a chilling memory. One night in 1997, she had received a phone call from Leigh, who told her that she had battered John with a frog because he was getting on her nerves. Valerie had dismissed it as a joke at the time, as it seemed typical of Leigh's eccentric behaviour, although she was concerned enough to call Leigh back a couple of days later to ask how John was. Supposedly, Leigh laughed off her concerns, saying, "Oh, he's all right, just the same," and acted as if the previous phone call had never happened. But John went missing around the same time and was never seen again. "The problem with Miss Sabine," said Valerie, "was you never knew if she was telling the truth or not." Upon hearing the story, Detective Chief Inspector Gareth Morgan of South Wales Police remembered a conversation with Michelle James. She told him that Leigh had given her permission to take anything she wanted from her flat after she died. "I don't suppose you have a stone frog?" Morgan asked James. Lo and behold, she did. Leigh Sabine had kept the frog by the side of her bed when she was alive, and James had taken it and kept it in a shoebox in her own house. When pathologists matched the frog stone against the injuries and skull fractures on John Sabine's head, the distinctive shape of its leg and eye fitted exactly. Leigh Sabine really had killed her husband with a frog all those years ago and even told people about it. When the news broke, it was hardly surprising to the children Leigh had abandoned in New Zealand. "I always knew Mum was capable of this," said Jane Sabine. "We may never know why she did it, but burying the past, literally and figuratively, seemed to be her way of coping." Stephen Sabine described his mother as a conniving to one newspaper. The fact that she claimed thousands of pounds by collecting John's pension and pretending he was still alive makes it hard to argue against him. "If anyone was going to do it, she was going to do it. My father was actually a good man, a soft-hearted man," said Stephen, "but she was a conniving. She controlled him, but he loved her to pieces. I could never forgive him for what he did, but I still believe he was manipulated, and he fell in love with an evil woman. That was his biggest crime." The Sabine family story is as disturbing as it is mysterious. It is possible that Leigh was a highly manipulative psychopath, capable of influencing John from the moment they met, leading him to abandon his first family and then their children in New Zealand. Despite their children noting that John seemed remorseful at times, he always sided with Leigh, perhaps out of fear or simply due to her powerful influence. After moving to the UK, it's possible that John began to feel the weight of his past actions and expressed dissatisfaction or regret, triggering Leigh to kill him to maintain control. As for Marty, the question still remains: did he know the truth about his father's fate, and was this knowledge a factor in his own tragic end? What role did Leigh play in his death? We will probably never know. So, that's it for tonight's bizarre video. Let me know what you all think in the comments down below. And don't forget to subscribe for more bizarre stories. Take care everyone, and good night.